Since we've been living now for, 16 months in a global pandemic, I'd like to turn to literature to look and see how things might have been similar or different in the way that they occurred or even were imagined in the past, and to see if our peculiar experience. I know at one time, Debbie and I were talking about walking around in the grocery store and how people seem to be disconnected, not just from each other, but even sort of from themselves. They looked like they were zombies of a sort. And I thought to myself, wow, this is a very peculiar sight. And what is the precedent for it? So here is the existentialist, the French writer Albert Camus, and his classic work just called The Plague. The Plague. And what we can find in great literature is an attempt to come to terms with something that we happen to be now experiencing, and so we can sort of compare notes. So The Plague is written during World War II. So right away we have a very interesting phenomenon. Camus writes the novel during the war and then publishes it right after World War II. So we have in the original readership of this novel people who are thinking not about plague, but about the war. And Camus, in a sense, relates the two. He implies that plague or a pandemic is a little bit like a war. It's like a war in two ways. First of all, it usually starts unexpectedly. Nobody knows, nobody predicts it. Remember World War I, an archduke is assassinated and boom, all of Europe is in a war. The coronavirus came really out of nowhere. We see a few signs of the Chinese fumigating their streets, and next thing you know, it's in New York, and it's all over the country. So it starts unexpectedly. It ends unexpectedly. The plague sort of goes away, or the epidemic comes to an end, and as wars do. And the other thing is that, and Camus is very clear about this, that wars and epidemics often last a lot longer than people think. People thought World War I would be really short. People thought World War II wouldn't last that long. People thought that we would have, a 2-week waiting period, and then we would be past the COVID-19. No. Now, Camus was born in Algeria, and he situates the plague in the Algerian port town of Oran. The plague begins because rats come into Oran through boats that are stationed at the harbor. And the story is told by a doctor named Ryu, who sees the rats. He wonders where are all these rats coming from? He doesn't really know. And then the concierge in the apartment complex he lives in dies. And he begins to worry that something is seriously wrong, that there is something being transmitted from the rats to humans. And it turns out the rats are releasing a type of flea that is infecting humans. And so he notifies the authorities, but, predictably, they're like, oh, no, let's not worry too much about this, and so on. And it takes the death toll to start climbing. And then the death toll becomes really serious. And then almost out of nowhere, there is a telegram from the prefect of Oran basically saying, I declare a plague, close the town. Close the town. And that means that the whole town of Oran is shut down. Nobody leaves. Nobody comes in. In fact, they won't even let people send letters. Why? Because the letters could be contaminated. And so you suddenly have this phenomenon of a whole town cut off from the world and now living with itself in isolation in a terrible plague. Now, Camus here is in a modernist tradition of writing about isolation. But typically for the modernist writers, I'm thinking here of people like Kafka, Franz Kafka, who wrote The Trial, or thinking even of Samuel Beckett in Waiting for Godot. In those cases, you have an individual, a solitary individual. In the case of Waiting for Godot, there are two guys, but nevertheless, the individual who is isolated from society. But remarkably for Camus, in The Plague, it is the whole town of Oran that is isolated. Everybody is, in a sense, put into a kind of cemetery and facing the prospect of death. And it's remarkable how little even medical science can do about it. Most of the time we see Dr. Ryu, he's trying to attend to the people who are sick, but he can't do a whole lot for them. He's just he's doing his best to comfort them, but they're going to die, many of them, anyway. Now, there's a remarkable scene where at one point there's a French journalist, a guy named Rambert, who comes to Dr. Ryu, and he basically says, hey, listen, he goes, I'm here from Paris, and I'm here to kind of cover the Arabs. I'm doing a kind of set of feature articles on the Arabs, so I've got nothing to do with this plague. I want a doctor's certificate from you. By the way, I happen to know some people at the embassy. They say that if I can get a doctor's certificate, I can get the heck out of here. And Dr. Ryu says, actually, no, I can't give you the certificate. And the guy goes, what? That's ridiculous. He goes, my wife is, well, she's not my wife, but the woman I'm living with, she's in Europe and she's back there. She's waiting for me and so on. And Dr. Ryu doesn't say anything, but Dr. Ryu's own wife, we happen to know, is actually in a sanitarium in a hospital outside of Iran, undergoing some serious treatment for what we don't exactly know, but he can't see her either. So he understands the situation. He happens to share the situation. And then the French journalist goes something like, you're such a heartless man because you won't let me leave. And why don't you just certify that I don't have the plague? And Dr. Ryu says, well, I can't certify that because I don't know that you don't have it. And moreover, even though you're in some ways different from the rest of us, you're a visitor, if you will, you just came here to cover a story, you're now kind of in the same boat with us. You share our situation. It is a common situation that we all have to share together. And so this goes on until, and then I find this line on page 183, to me very poignant. He says that the plague created a kind of zombie quality in the town. He doesn't use that word, but he says, quote, the town was peopled with sleepwalkers. It's almost as if people are walking around in a daze, as if they're half asleep. And the reason is that they are taking blows from the plague and they don't really know how to cope with it, or if they will ever come out of it. And so their whole lives take on a completely new significance. Now, I want to pivot briefly from this to the philosophical underpinning of all this. Camus wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus and other essays. And the myth of Sisyphus involves a Greek character, Sisyphus, who apparently angered the gods. And as his punishment, he was condemned to roll a stone up the hill. But of course, the myth of Sisyphus is that when he rolls a stone up the hill, it rolls back down, and Sisyphus' eternal punishment is to then roll it back up again, and down it comes again, unceasingly. And for Camus, and we see this echoed even in The Plague, it's a little bit like that is a metaphor for life. Camus is living at a time when he felt that belief in God had become impossible. In other words, the common belief in God that had sustained Western civilization for centuries was now, quote, unbelievable. And therefore, we human beings have life to live, but life to what end? After all, death will end all our projects. Everything we're doing comes to a crashing, burning end. You may say we're all living with the plague and we're all living under kind of a death sentence. And so what's the point of it all? Aren't we all in the position of Sisyphus, rolling the stone up the hill and down it comes and roll it up again? And Camus' novel, in a sense, sort of faces up to this, what he calls absurdity. It's the philosophy of the absurd. And by absurd here, we mean meaninglessness. Now, Camus says that the reason that our life is such a tragedy, the reason we're living in the absurd situation is not just because life is meaningless. He goes, the life of a fly is meaningless. He goes, but a fly is not conscious of that. Meaninglessness by itself is not absurd. But he goes, with man, you have meaninglessness combined with a desperate need for meaning, a desperate search for meaning. So when you're searching for meaning and the meaning ultimately isn't there, then you have the situation of the absurd. And so Camus says, what do we do? What do we do in this situation of godlessness? And ultimately, the best he can offer, and to me it's a very unsatisfactory remedy, is he says essentially we have to embrace the Sisyphusian project. We have to accept that our life is nothing more than struggle, and what is the purpose of it? Well, there is none. Will we ever get the stone to the top of the hill? No. And for Dr. Ryu, attending to the plague, he's not in control. He doesn't even really cure anyone. At one point, there's a sort of vaccine that is proposed, and they give the vaccine to a kid. It only prolongs his agony. And so Dr. Ryu is himself Sisyphus. He's himself rolling the stone up the hill. But he essentially says, listen, this is all I can do. I'm a human being. I've got to try to attend to people as best I can. If I don't have a cure, maybe my presence will be some sort of a consolation. This becomes, for Camus, a metaphor for life itself, but a life lived, you may say, in the loneliness of the absence of God.